Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive deep into one of history's most tragically hilarious jobs, the medieval court jester. You know, the funny guy who wore a silly hat and made the king laugh, or else. But before we jump into the laughable despair of living in a world where your only job was to entertain a guy who could have you executed for looking at him funny, do me a solid, like this video, subscribe if you actually enjoy this, no pressure, and drop a comment below to tell me where you're listening from. I'm always curious if you're out there in the middle of the night, eating chips in your pajamas, or pretending you're just resting your eyes. Now dim those lights, turn on your fan for that soft white noise, and get cozy. Maybe pull the blankets up tight. Ever wondered what it would feel like to get paid to make fun of a king who could have you thrown in the dungeon if you said something wrong? What do you think a medieval king would do if you told a joke that totally bombed? Would they laugh, or would you end up in the stocks with tomatoes flying at your face? Can you imagine trying to entertain a bunch of nobles who just want to hear jokes about royal butt cracks while wearing a hat that makes you look like an oversized pancake? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1350, medieval Europe, where your job is to make the king giggle or face the cons. Imagine being the only person in the room whose job it is to make sure everyone laughs, even when you've got nothing funny to say. That's the life of a court jester. You're basically a medieval version of a social media influencer, except instead of sponsored posts, you're juggling, telling crude jokes, and hoping the king doesn't fall asleep mid-performance. Forget about privacy. Your whole life is an open book for everyone to comment on, critique, and mock. No wonder these guys often had a very short shelf life. If you didn't make the king laugh, you might be shown the door, or the executioner's block. The job of the court jester was like trying to juggle flaming torches while balancing on a tightrope made of spaghetti. It was delicate, stressful, and one wrong move meant disaster. Imagine standing in front of a room full of nobles, trying to get a laugh out of a king who probably just finished yelling at someone for misplacing his favorite spoon. You have to be the funniest person in the room, all while knowing that a bad joke could end your career or your life. How's that for job security? It's like being the office clown, but your boss is the one who holds a guillotine over your head, and instead of a paycheck, you get a bag of stale bread, if you're lucky. The humor they used was also far from family-friendly. We're talking about some seriously crude jokes here. Think of the most awkward and inappropriate comment you've ever heard at a family dinner. Now multiply that by 100 and toss in a noble audience that doesn't mind a little dark humor. Some jesters became famous for their ability to mock everyone, from the king himself to his court of sycophants. Of course, they had to be careful with their jabs, because one poorly timed comment about a royal's latest wig or questionable hairstyle could result in them being escorted out by the local executioner. And let's not forget the physical aspect of the job. Medieval jesters had to be masters of slapstick comedy. We're talking about physical feats that would make you question how they didn't break every bone in their body. They'd jump, trip, fall over, and somehow make it look intentional, all to get a chuckle out of the king. Ever tried to make someone laugh by hitting yourself in the face with a fish? No? Well, that was just a typical day on the job for these guys. It's like being a walking, talking, medieval YouTube fail compilation, except you couldn't edit out the parts where it went terribly wrong. The jester's role was also a bit of a paradox. You were a fool by title, but you had to be the smartest person in the room. This wasn't just a job for someone who liked to play pranks. It required wit, timing, and an understanding of human nature. You had to know exactly what to say and when to say it, and you had to read the room better than a high schooler reading their crush's text messages. A jester couldn't just make silly faces. They had to offer biting commentary on society, politics, and the occasional royal scandal. Ever made a cutting remark about your boss's last promotion? Now imagine doing that in front of a room full of people who could have you executed for doing the same thing. But the real kicker here is that no matter how clever, witty, or talented you were, your fate was always in someone else's hands. If you got lucky, your performance would land you a place in the court's heart, and maybe, just maybe, you'd be invited to the king's next feast. But if you were unlucky, well, let's just say your next gig might involve being thrown into the dungeon. Talk about high stakes. It's like getting a bonus if you make your boss laugh. But if you bomb, you're stuck in the timeout room until they decide if you're still useful. No pressure, right? So, here's the thing. Jesters had to be not only comedians, but also survivors. They had to navigate the delicate dance of making fun of the people who literally had the power to end their lives. They were political commentators, jesters, and performers, all rolled into one with a big dose of danger thrown in. They might have been the most ridiculous people in the room, but they were also some of the most observant and clever, and the fact that they survived, some even thrived, while managing to dodge the royal wrath, well, that's a comedy act in itself. In the end, the life of a court jester wasn't just about slapstick or jokes about royal butt cracks. It was about playing a dangerous game of survival, wit, and timing. You had to make them laugh, or else. That's the life of a jester, part entertainer, part punching bag, and all risk. Ah, the jester's outfit. Not only was it itchy and probably full of lice, but it was also a walking, talking joke in itself. Picture it. Tights, bells, and a hat that looked like it was inspired by a confused raccoon. No one else in the kingdom wore anything remotely like it, so it wasn't just a uniform, it was a performance before you even opened your mouth. And you thought the 80s were a fashion disaster. At least in the modern world, no one forces you to wear something that could double as a circus tent. But the jester, his whole life was a walking fashion nightmare, and he wasn't even allowed to complain. Let's start with the tights. Yes, tights. Not just any tights, though. Tight, itchy, skin-tight garments that made you look like a human sausage wrapped in colorful thread. And of course, these tights weren't designed for comfort. If you've ever squeezed into a pair of jeans that are just a little too tight, you've got an inkling of how the jester must have felt. Except imagine those jeans being made of wool, rubbing against your skin all day, while you're desperately trying to crack jokes in front of a royal audience. If you've ever complained about your leggings getting uncomfortable during a long Netflix binge, imagine that, but with no chance of taking them off for a full 12 hours, all while trying to entertain a bunch of people who think fart jokes are the height of sophistication. And then there were the bells. Oh, the bells. They were probably the most obnoxious part of the whole ensemble. They jingled and jangled with every step the jester took, so even if the joke was dead in the water, everyone could hear the jester coming. It's like trying to sneak into your house in the middle of the night, only to realize you're wearing flip-flops that sound like a herd of elephants. Imagine trying to sneak up behind someone, only to be met with the loudest, most insistent sound, announcing your presence in the most awkward way possible. The bells weren't there to help you blend in. They were there to make sure everyone knew you were a walking clown show. If subtlety was your thing, this was not your gig. Then, of course, there was the hat. Oh, the hat. Picture a cone-shaped disaster with pointy tips that might have been made for a child's birthday party, except the child was the king. The hat was essentially an advertisement for how ridiculous the jester was. And it wasn't just any hat. It had floppy tips that jutted out in all directions like a squirrel with bad posture. The best part? It probably didn't fit very well, constantly slipping off your head mid-performance, which added a bonus bit of slapstick comedy to your already embarrassing look. Can you imagine trying to entertain the king while your hat keeps falling over your eyes? It's like wearing a birthday party decoration on your head that also makes you a walking target for criticism. At least when modern-day clowns wear hats, it's a choice. For medieval jesters, it was their job. Let's not forget the colors. Bright, loud, and in most cases, clashing. Picture a highlighter pink and neon green outfit that had the subtlety of a toddler's drawing, except you're performing in front of a royal court, and you can't take the colors off. If the jester had any hope of blending in, they were out of luck. It's like showing up to a job interview in a neon tracksuit and hoping no one notices. While the rest of the nobles were dressed in fine silks and velvets, you, my friend, were in what could best be described as the medieval version of a joke. You didn't even get a choice in your wardrobe. It was essentially, wear this or lose your job. Talk about fashion tyranny. And yet the jester had no choice but to wear the ridiculous outfit every single day. It wasn't like today, where you could have a bad fashion day and still get away with it. Nope. The jester's wardrobe was a constant reminder of their job. Clownish, loud, and utterly bizarre. But you know what? It wasn't just for show. It was a way to remind the court who you were. Someone who didn't take themselves seriously, yet whose job was, ironically, to make everyone else laugh. The absurdity of the outfit was part of the humor. After all, it would be hard to take someone seriously if they were wearing a hat that looked like it belonged to a circus clown who had run out of ideas, and yet the jester somehow made it work. Maybe it was the fact that the absurdity of the outfit was its own form of comedy. After all, when you're dressed like a walking joke, it's hard not to get a laugh. It was almost as if the outfit's ridiculousness became a shield, a way to deflect attention from how much of a disaster the actual performance might have been. So, next time you complain about wearing your favorite oversized hoodie for the third day in a row, just remember, at least you don't have to wear an itchy, bell-covered outfit every time you want to make a joke. Being a jester, that's a whole different kind of fashion nightmare.
Now let's talk about the real danger in the life of a jester, the king's sense of humor. See, back then, jokes didn't always land in the safest ways. If you cracked a joke that didn't quite meet the royal standards of funny, the penalty wasn't a bad review. It was potentially a death sentence. Ever try telling a joke to someone with a fragile ego who also holds the power of life and death in their hands? It's like being the guy who accidentally told the boss the wrong thing at the Christmas party, except the boss could toss you in a dungeon if they didn't like your punchline. There was literally no room for error. Imagine this. You've spent hours perfecting a joke, pacing around in your ridiculous outfit, hoping to get at least a chuckle out of the king. You take your chance, throw in your punchline, and nothing. Silence. And not just any silence. A silence so heavy you could feel the weight of every noble in the room staring at you, judging. It's like telling a dad joke at a dinner party, but the dad is an actual monarch who could decide that your oops moment requires a one-way ticket to the gallows. The stakes here weren't just the pride of the jester, it was their very survival. Now, you might be wondering, how could a jester ever feel safe cracking a joke in such a high-risk environment? Well, it was all about reading the room, an art form that could save your life. You had to understand the king's mood better than anyone, which meant you needed to have the instincts of a therapist, a mind reader, and a comedian all rolled into one. You had to figure out whether the king had a rough day or was in the mood to roast someone with a funny comment. And if you misjudged, oh boy, it's like sending a sarcastic text to the wrong person, but with much more severe consequences. You couldn't just go in, tell a random joke, and hope for the best. Timing was everything. One thing to keep in mind was the fact that medieval kings didn't always appreciate humor that made them look foolish. They had egos the size of castles, and being made the butt of a joke wasn't exactly on their to-do list. So, a jester's best bet was often self-deprecating humor. Make fun of yourself before you make fun of anyone else. But even then, you had to be careful. You couldn't be too funny, because then the king might think you were challenging his authority, and that would end poorly for you. It's like trying to be funny in a meeting, but realizing the boss might take your joke as a jab at their leadership skills. But here, instead of a stern email, you might get thrown into the tower. The irony, of course, is that while jesters had to navigate these treacherous waters, their humor was often the only thing that could keep the nobles entertained. Nobles who, by the way, didn't exactly have the best sense of humor themselves. Imagine you're the king, and your court is filled with sycophants who laugh at the most basic things to stay in the king's good graces. That's the situation a jester was working with, trying to make an audience laugh while keeping in mind that their laughter might be the difference between a nice meal and a trip to the executioner. And let's not forget the king's audience, the nobles. These people were often just as fickle and temperamental as the king. One false move, and you'd be ridiculed by a bunch of people who would not hesitate to throw you under the royal bus if it meant getting a laugh. You ever felt the anxiety of making a joke at a family gathering, worried no one would laugh, and you'd be stuck with awkward silence? Multiply that by 1,000, and you've got the jester's life. Except this time, the silence isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. The pressure was relentless. Your job wasn't just to entertain. It was to avoid angering the most powerful people in the room while also dealing with your own life or death punchlines. Let's face it, in modern times, we have it easy. If we tell a bad joke, the worst thing that happens is someone might roll their eyes or change the topic. But in the Middle Ages, bad humor could get you more than just an awkward silence. It could get you thrown into the dungeon, or worse. Can you imagine that kind of pressure? Having to walk into a room every day, knowing that one poorly timed joke could have you in the stocks, or facing the royal wrath. It's like trying to make a great impression at your first job, while knowing that one wrong move could cost you your career. But instead of just getting fired, you might find yourself locked away in some grimy, rat-infested prison with only the company of your terrible jokes to keep you company. In the end, a jester's humor wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about playing with fire every single day, knowing that the wrong punchline could burn you to the ground. But hey, at least it wasn't boring. You're a jester, so you're expected to entertain during the king's lavish feasts. Except, here's the catch. The only time you get to eat is when someone throws you a scrap from the royal table. How's that for dinner plans? Ever tried eating a soggy piece of bread while surrounded by nobles who are feasting on boar? It's like being the least invited guest at a 5-star buffet. And speaking of food, there were no gourmet snacks here, just bread, gruel, and the occasional hunk of mystery meat. If you've ever been to a buffet where the food was colder than the looks from the person at the table next to you, you've got an inkling of what medieval feasts were like. Let's be clear about something. Medieval feasts weren't like the buffet at your local Golden Corral. Oh no, these events were extravagant, full of rich food, expensive wines, and roast meats that probably came from animals you couldn't even name. Picture a giant pig on a spit, turning slowly in front of an audience of nobles who are laughing too loudly at their own jokes, which are probably terrible. These meals were the ultimate display of wealth and status. The king and his noble pals were lounging back, stuffing their faces with delicate pastries and roasted meats, while the jester, your humble self, was probably sitting off to the side, trying to snag any scraps that might happen to fall within your reach. Now, let's talk about the actual food you're eating as the jester. Because, spoiler alert, it wasn't nearly as glamorous as those roast boar carcasses. You're lucky if you get a crust of stale bread that's been sitting out for too long. Remember that mystery meat I mentioned earlier? Yeah, that's the kind of meat that's not really identifiable. It could have been anything. You know how sometimes when you eat a meal and think, that tastes like chicken, but also like shoe leather? Well, in the jester's world, that was considered a gourmet option. But at least you're getting something, right? While the nobles are diving into golden dishes, eating like the medieval equivalent of royalty, you're hoping that someone at the table might toss you a bone, or more accurately, a half-eaten hunk of bread that's been drenched in gravy. Can you imagine? You're the jester, expected to entertain with juggling, witty remarks, and clever dances, all while desperately hoping that someone, anyone, will give you a bite of food that wasn't served to the dog. And, of course, there's no room for complaining about it. Remember, you're not just the jester, you're also the royal clown. You have to be happy, bright, and cheerful at all times, no matter how much you want to throw a tantrum, because your meal consists of a cold piece of gruel and a spoonful of something that might have once been soup. If you've ever had to pretend to be in a good mood when you were actually starving, maybe because you had to wait for a snack during a really long meeting, then you get a little taste of what being a jester was like. You had to smile and entertain, all while your stomach growled in protest, and you watched as nobles gorged themselves like it was their last meal on earth. Speaking of gruel, let's talk about the real joy of medieval meals. Gruel was basically the medieval version of what we'd call mystery oatmeal. It was made by boiling grains, usually barley or oats, until they turned into a thin, watery mush. It wasn't exactly a Michelin star meal, more like something you'd eat when your mum was trying to stretch a can of soup to feed a family of 5. Gruel wasn't even considered a full meal. It was more like a filler to keep the peasants from starving to death. And yet, if you were a jester, this was probably your best option. Delicious, right? No wonder jesters were often more skilled at acrobatics than they were at eating. If they weren't quick enough, they'd be lucky to get any gruel at all. But let's not forget the real challenge of these feasts, the performance. The food might have been awful, but you still had to make sure the nobles were laughing. Imagine trying to balance an acrobatic act, or pull off a witty remark while the smell of roasted meats and delicious sauces wafts through the air, and your stomach feels like it's turning into a black hole. You're the court entertainer, but you're also the one who's likely sitting there wondering if the crumbs that fell from the royal table are actually worth diving for. It's it's like being asked to perform stand-up comedy while you're the only one at the party without a drink. And instead of taking a sip of water, you're just hoping a waiter might pass by and toss you a scrap of something edible. In the end, these feasts were a bizarre mix of indulgence for the nobles and sheer starvation for the jester. You'd be surrounded by the laughter of people who had no idea what it was like to eat nothing but stale bread for days while trying to make them laugh. It's like being invited to the most extravagant party of the year, but the only thing you can afford is a half-eaten slice of pizza someone forgot about in the corner. At least you were getting something, even if it was mostly cold, soggy, and entirely unsatisfying. So, next time you complain about having to eat leftovers, just be thankful you're not trying to entertain a bunch of nobles while surviving on scraps from their table. In the modern world, we have performance reviews to tell us how we're doing. But in the medieval court, your review could happen in the blink of an eye, during the middle of a performance, in front of the whole court. The king didn't like your joke about his crown? That's it. You're out of a job, and possibly out of life. Imagine trying to perform while knowing that one poorly timed joke could get you dragged out by the guards. It's like being judged by the harshest online reviewers. But the stakes are literally your head. Talk about pressure. The problem was, unlike modern performance reviews where you might get a chance to improve or even have a meeting with your boss to discuss next steps, a jester didn't get a second chance. Your meeting with the king could be over before you even started, especially if you said the wrong thing. Picture being the only person at the royal dinner table trying to entertain an audience of nobles who are only there because they don't have anything better to do, while also praying to whatever gods might be listening that your joke doesn't make the king roll his eyes and wave you off. And if you missed, the punishment wasn't a casual conversation about how to work on your material. No, it could end in a public humiliation, a night in the dungeon, or, if the joke was particularly offensive, a one-way trip to the executioner. Imagine having your entire career hanging on whether or not you can make the king laugh at a fart joke. That's pressure. Now, let's dive into the types of reviews these jesters had to face. In the modern office, performance reviews are typically a sit-down affair, right? You get to hear feedback on what you're doing well, and if you're lucky, you might be told what you could improve on. In the medieval court, the review happened in real time. There was no annual feedback session where you could plead your case or explain yourself. If your joke bombed, you had to pack up your jester's bells, which would jingle all the way to your execution. If the king didn't laugh, well, guess what? You're no longer the funny guy. They'll probably find someone else who can at least crack a joke without getting dragged to the stocks. Let's talk about what it was like to actually perform under these conditions. You're standing there in front of a room full of nobles, each one likely waiting for the slightest excuse to make you look foolish. Ever had to tell a joke while knowing that, if it flopped, you'd have a very real and immediate consequence? Imagine being on stage at an open mic night and realizing that if your set goes poorly, you're not just losing fans, you're losing your job, your reputation, and possibly your life. But the jester wasn't just performing for the king. They were performing for the entire court, which included advisors, knights, and courtiers, all of whom had an agenda and an opinion. The pressure was on to not just make the king laugh, but to make everyone laugh. Because if the king saw his nobles smirking, he'd be that much more likely to keep you around. But here's the kicker. The worst reviews weren't necessarily about the quality of your jokes. Nope, they were all about timing. A jester could have the best material in the kingdom, but if the king was in a bad mood, or worse yet, had a massive ego, no joke would land. Think of it like trying to tell a really good joke to a friend who's been having a bad day. You know it's funny, but they're just not having it. Now imagine that friend has the power to imprison you if they don't like your sense of humor. The tension in those situations was likely thicker than the smell of stale bread in the court. The jester might perform an elaborate routine, but if the king wasn't feeling it, there was no mercy. The king didn't just want to laugh, he wanted to feel superior while doing it. One wrong move, and the jester would be reminded that royal egos were fragile, especially in the presence of someone who was literally there to make them look ridiculous. On top of all that, the feedback was instantaneous. No waiting for a quarterly report here. The king's displeasure could show up in a glance or a raised eyebrow, and that was all the jester would get. It's like being judged by the most indecisive critic who gives you feedback based on their mood instead of the performance itself. And the consequences weren't just about losing your job. They were about how quickly the king could decide your fate. The jester might make a funny remark about the king's wardrobe, but if that wardrobe was too new or too important, the king's face could freeze up faster than you could say, "Exit stage left." The absurdity of it all was that the jester, with all their tricks, jokes, and clever remarks, had very little power in a world where the king held everything: life, death, and the jester's very career in the palm of his hand. The jester's worst enemy wasn't the lack of funny material. It was the unpredictability of the king's mood. And that was a performance review nobody ever wanted. Despite their ridiculous appearances, jesters weren't just there to look silly. They were often the smartest people in the room. They had to be. They needed to read the room, understand human nature, and improvise on the spot. They were like medieval stand-up comedians with the intellect of modern-day philosophers. While others were busy partying, these jesters were cracking social commentary, making fun of the world, and occasionally making a few too many pointed remarks about the nobility. If you've ever been the person at a party who sees right through everyone's superficial nonsense, you'll understand why being a jester was both dangerous and oddly impressive. You see, medieval jesters weren't just hired to juggle or tell knock-knock jokes. They were, in fact, sharp observers of society, and their role required them to be much more than the bumbling, silly fools they appeared to be. They had to know how to read the room and use their wit in ways that not only entertained, but also made subtle commentaries on the people around them, especially the royals. Picture it. You're standing in front of the king, who probably just had his breakfast served by 1,000 servants, and you've got to make him laugh, but without making him feel too inferior. No big deal, right? It wasn't just about funny faces and pratfalls. It was about walking the razor-thin line between cleverness and execution. A jester's life was one of constant mental gymnastics. It's like being on a stage, juggling balls while solving a Rubik's Cube in your head, all while trying to avoid making eye contact with the king's executioner standing at the back of the room. Because if you went too far with your social commentary, if you pointed out how corrupt the nobility were or made too many jokes about the king's lavish lifestyle, well, your performance might come to a sudden and final halt. Jesters were like the medieval version of social media influencers who had to keep their followers, in this case the king, happy, but also occasionally ruffle a few feathers. They had to be quick-witted, constantly on their toes, and armed with a deep understanding of what people wanted to hear, or what they needed to hear. But here's the catch. While jesters were often seen as lowly entertainers, their intelligence made them the unspoken masters of social commentary. Medieval society was a rigid hierarchy, and the nobility didn't want to be reminded of the fact that their luxurious lives were built on the backs of peasants. But the jester, he was the only one who could get away with calling out that fact. Ever been at a party where everyone's pretending things are fine, but you're the only one who sees the chaos underneath the surface? That's the position a jester was in. They were the only ones who could openly mock the nobles, point out their flaws, and still walk away with their head intact. That takes some serious intellect. Jesters didn't just make fun of the king's outfit or tell silly jokes. They had to be tactful, making their remarks just clever enough that the king might laugh, but not so cutting that they offended him. It was like being a political comedian today, but with far more at risk. Imagine trying to roast your boss on national TV, but without the option of editing out the parts where they don't laugh. They had to gauge every comment, every joke, every line for its risk factor. And they had to do it all in real time. No script, no practice runs, just pure, unscripted improvisation. Imagine walking into your office every day, knowing that any slip-up could cost you your career. It wasn't just about delivering jokes. It was about reading the audience, in this case the king and his court, and knowing exactly how far to push things. A single misstep could send you straight to the dungeon. But it wasn't just about making the king laugh. Jesters were often the ones who had the most insight into what was really going on in the kingdom. While the nobles were busy hosting lavish feasts, the jester was picking up on the subtle dynamics of power, the undercurrents of discontent, and the real state of the kingdom. It's like being the one person at a dinner party who actually listens to the conversation happening behind the scenes, picking up on the things everyone else is too distracted to notice. In a way, jesters were both insiders and outsiders. They had to be part of the court's daily operations, but they also had a bird's-eye view of everything going on around them. They saw the cracks in the royal facade, and occasionally they had the chance to call attention to those cracks if they were clever enough. And despite their ridiculous costumes and the perception that they were simply fools, jesters held a unique position in medieval society. They were able to critique the system that kept them in such ridiculous outfits, and in many cases, they were the ones who had the sharpest insight into how things really worked. They weren't just entertainers. They were social commentators, philosophers, and sometimes even activists. They could make the king laugh, but they could also make him think. And considering the world they lived in, where most people had little to no say in their own fate, that kind of influence was powerful. In the end, the jester's secret was that while everyone else was busy playing the game of courtly politics, the jester was observing, learning, and using humor to carve out a small but important space of influence in a world that would have otherwise silenced their voice. They were fools, yes, but in the best way possible. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed with soft sheets and a nice hot cup of something comforting, maybe even with a spoon that's actually clean, take a moment to appreciate the absolute absurdity of being a medieval court jester. Because while they were juggling, cracking jokes, and sometimes risking their heads just to make a few people laugh, we have it pretty easy. No one's throwing you into the dungeon if you tell a bad joke at a dinner party. You're not about to lose your job or your life for a poorly timed punchline. You can laugh, relax, and even choose what you eat for dinner. No soggy bread or mystery meat required. But as you drift off tonight, maybe think about the resilience of those jesters. Sure, they wore ridiculous outfits and had to make a king laugh for survival, but they were also sharp, smart, and, in their own way, incredibly brave. They took risks, often at great personal cost, just to bring a bit of laughter into a world that wasn't all that funny. They made fun of the nobility, pointed out the flaws in society, and somehow survived to tell the tale, most of the time. So, as you snuggle in, cozy and safe, remember that history is full of absurd, ridiculous, and often hilarious people who survived in ways we can barely imagine. And maybe, just maybe, whisper a little thank you to your ancestors who survived lice, leeches, and a diet of gruel that would make even the toughest person want to scream. Because history may be gross and terrifying, but it's also proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and kind of ridiculous. Just like that jester, juggling for his life, one joke at a time. So sleep tight and remember, no matter how bad your day was, at least you didn't have to entertain a king while wearing tights that were too tight and trying to get away with a joke about his crown. Good night.